Well, the Florida Panthers have won the 2025 Stanley Cup, and I was just enjoying my chocolate chip cookie dough blizzard from Dairy Queen in peace, just like Brad Marchand has been doing throughout the playoffs, so I could just feel a little more victorious. What is going on, everyone? My name's Tristan Folks, and today we're going to wrap up this series of the 2025 Stanley Cup playoffs, what we've learned. So first, I'll end up reviewing the series in one sentence, obviously, and then we'll look at some stats, and then afterwards, we'll look at the official bracket, and then we will compare it to mine to see what I thought then and now. And then lastly, I will give each playoff team a report card rating based on my expectations and then my thoughts on their overall performance. Other than that, let's get right into this 2025 Stanley Cup Final review. Game 1, Edmonton comes from behind at home to force overtime with Leon Draisaitl scoring the game winner. Game 2, Edmonton responds late to force overtime, but Florida wins it in second overtime with Brad Marchand winning it for the Panthers. Game 3, Florida gets a dominant win at home to take the series lead for the first time. Game 4, Edmonton makes a comeback after Stuart Skinner gets chased out the net with Calvin Pickard standing on his head to help tie the series, and Draisaitl wins it in overtime. Game 5, Florida silences the crowd on the road to put Edmonton on the brink of elimination. And in Game 6, Sam Reinhart scores 4 goals to help the Florida Panthers win back-to-back Stanley Cups, both over Edmonton. Honestly, this year, the series was honestly much more competitive than last year because we saw Florida go up 3-0, then we saw Edmonton win 3 games in a row to tie the series. And then we saw the Game 7 where Florida ultimately won their first Stanley Cup. They have 2 now, obviously, now. So, honestly, I talked about in the preview about taking penalties against Florida. Florida absolutely got them on that. And also, Edmonton just couldn't outscore Florida for the most part when it came to the first period, in my opinion, which was a big difference maker. And Florida just really didn't let off the gas at all. And when Edmonton did let off the gas or made a mistake, Florida pretty much just made them pay the price, which that all goes credit to their forechecking. So other than that, let's look at some stats really quick. Talking about penalties, there's a certain player on the Edmonton Oilers who loved just taking penalties in this series. It was the most undisciplined player overall, and then he gets a misconduct at the end of the series. Pretty much unacceptable. Evander Kane ends up taking 32 penalty minutes. That is insane in a Stanley Cup Final. 32 penalty minutes. That is over 5 penalty minutes per game, and that is completely unacceptable if you're trying to win a Stanley Cup. This includes his misconducts, fighting. He also took a good amount of penalties too overall. So honestly, very unacceptable for Evander Kane to be doing that. A big factor of why Florida ended up getting power play goals, in my opinion. And then also in their first periods, they allowed 11 out of 28 goals from the Florida Panthers in that first period, which was overall the most that they were letting in. So their first periods, I don't want to say that they were playing poor at all, but it just seemed Florida would just end up finding the net before Edmonton did, which was the overall difference maker. And then a lot of people want to talk about Connor McDavid not showing up. He ends up getting 1 goal, 6 assists, 7 points. All that's not bad, even though this is like comparing him to Mitch Marner when Mitch Marner wasn't scoring goals, but he had like 10 points. And McDavid ends up finishing with a -7. So the -7 is the one that stands out for me. I felt he was a big blame for the Tkachuk goal, which it didn't end up being the game winner, but he was just on the ice a lot when they were scoring, honestly. He could have been on the ice for 14 Florida goals for all we know, but honestly, I think McDavid needs to do a little better when it comes to his leadership, because it just seemed like he wasn't there and he was just in his own little world, in my opinion. Talking about penalties once again, this time we're going to talk about the Florida Panthers power play. In the first 5 games, they go 7 for 23. They did not see a power play in Game 6 at all. So that is a percentage of over 30%. If you recall in the preview, Edmonton was killing penalties at about 70%, which was not a very good number. So that number honestly very much lined up from the preview. And then we are going to look at our Conn Smythe winner, and that was Sam Bennett. Throughout the playoffs, he played 23 games. He ends up getting 15 goals, 7 assists, 22 points, and finishing with a +6. A very good playoffs overall for Sam Bennett. Lastly but not least, we are going to look at Brad Marchand in the Stanley Cup Final. He ends up getting 6 goals. He doesn't get any assists, but honestly, who cares? And obviously the 6 goals along with the 6 points. He ends up getting a +6 for his plus-minus. And he also probably had 6 blizzards as well from Dairy Queen. So a lot of 6s and just 1 0. So honestly, very good final for Brad Marchand. Other than that, we're going to look at the official bracket. Obviously, you have Florida coming on top over the Edmonton Oilers for the 2. President's Trophy winner Winnipeg notably gets knocked out in round 2. Didn't see a lot of upsets in this playoff at all. The East kind of went fairly as expected in my opinion. Florida honestly just crashed the party for me, which we'll look at my bracket pretty soon. And then the West, thought we saw some shocking things over there at times, but can't say the West was overall shocking. Overall, just not really a lot of upsets throughout this playoff. So overall, this is your official bracket. And now for the fun, we're going to get to look at my own bracket, and we're going to see how good it honestly did. I don't think it did good at all, honestly, but I don't regret how it went. So I'm going to share my thoughts real quick on that. The Toronto over Ottawa series just went as expected. And then between Florida and Tampa, I did not know Florida was going to come right out the gates at all immediately after a sluggish regular season. And then Tampa just didn't show up either to help their case. I don't think injuries for Tampa helped them either, which is why I didn't have expectations compared to others for them to not do any better in advance of round 2. Washington over Montreal went fairly as expected, even though Montreal gave them a run for their money. Carolina over New Jersey went as expected. And then out in the West, Winnipeg over St. Louis did not shock me, but how the series went was completely wild, especially how it ended. And then, as mentioned before, all the way back from round 1, Dallas didn't lead much at all over Colorado. I thought the Avalanche would have had this series, which they really should have. And they had everything they needed, and yes, it's hard to win a Stanley Cup, and let alone win the Stanley Cup playoffs. But they just found ways to keep Dallas close too many times, in my opinion, and just gave them life or just let them run away with it. The other one is Vegas over Minnesota. Not shocked that Vegas won, but it was a shocker how the series went. And I started to question whether Minnesota was going to end up knocking Vegas out. Didn't happen that way. And then the series between LA and Edmonton took a complete turn after Game 2. And as much as I expected the Oilers to win the series, I didn't expect them to control the remainder of the series. And moving on to round 2, seeing Toronto in round 2 was not a shocker. I don't regret having to move on, but as mentioned, did not know what the Panthers were going to bring coming in, honestly. And then between Washington and Carolina, I knew that Washington was going to have their collapse moment, and they indeed did it against Carolina. And then out in the West, I didn't have Winnipeg advancing past round 2, which was as expected, but I went consistent with my bracket on the revision after round 1 to have them move on based on my consistency. Dallas ends up being the one who knocks them out instead of Colorado. And then between Vegas and Edmonton, Vegas wasn't very great at all throughout the playoffs, and Edmonton just didn't give them a ton of life either. Injuries played a factor. I thought Edmonton wasn't as good as last year. I still feel that way. And Vegas just really was not themselves. I thought they were going to have that deep playoff run. And then on to the conference finals between Carolina and Florida. I knew Carolina would make it this far, but they just completely shut down for the first 3 games. But they won one at least, and I'm surprised at this point they haven't figured it out yet. And I figured whoever played them would struggle, but it didn't happen that way. And then for the Western Conference final matchup, this one was just a complete miss, but I shared why I thought we see Colorado and Vegas, because I thought they both make deep runs. But we got Edmonton versus Dallas, and I ended up getting that one correct after my revision, which wasn't a surprise at all. Just a shock that Dallas didn't really give a good effort. And then my Stanley Cup Final obviously missed, and then it missed again as my final revision had Edmonton beating Florida in 6. And it pretty much just went the other way around. So it is what it is. And, Florida was winning the battle more than Edmonton and wanting it more. So now we're going to do the report cards on each playoff team. And I've created the final standings based on how many games a team was eliminated in and then the round it occurred. And then for the situation that teams getting knocked out in the same round of games in the same round, I'll use the NHL regular season as my tiebreaker to decide who finishes ahead. And for some reason, if they're still tied, it will just go the seeding. Starting off, finishing 16th, we have the Montreal Canadiens. I'm going to be giving them a C+. The Montreal Canadiens were the youngest team coming into these playoffs, if I'm not mistaken, and they were just honestly happy to be there. I thought they were fighting with Washington, but the experience was the overall difference maker why Washington ended up pulling away in this series. But they sure learned a lot overall, and they're going to be so much better when they return to the Stanley Cup playoffs. They weren't spectacular or great most of the time, but they tried. Finishing 15th, we have the New Jersey Devils. I'm just giving them a C, honestly. The New Jersey Devils were the most injured team coming into these playoffs, which is why I had the bar set low for them. They gave it what they could, in my opinion, but Carolina just completely overwhelmed them. And that's not surprising based on the circumstances. I don't think they got the right coach to take them to the promised land, but they weren't bad at all. And going on to 14th, we have the Tampa Bay Lightning, which is my favorite team, and they are getting a D-. The Tampa Bay Lightning decided just not to show up again. Very similar to last year. They came into the playoffs actually looking good, and then they had a couple of injuries that I felt hurt their chances, so I kept that into account. But it doesn't excuse the rest of the team just not showing up at all. It was very lackluster. It was very disappointing. They found about every single way to lose a game to the Florida Panthers, and they ended up winning one game. And I expect this team to be better during the regular season next year, as the team should look quite identical from the post-trade deadline, so it still may not be enough in the future though. Finishing 13th, I have the Minnesota Wild, and I'm actually giving them a B-. The Minnesota Wild actually surprised me in this series. Even though they didn't win the series, they were impressive, and they had all these injuries, but they just couldn't close out their games. We saw players like Matt Boldy rise to the occasion, and they had lots of injuries as mentioned as well, but they did not let that play a factor to them, and they gave it their best. I'm not sure how much better the Minnesota Wild will be next year, but they just need to be healthy to go on a true run. Finishing in 12th, I have the Ottawa Senators, and they'll be getting a C+ from me. They were eliminated in 6 games as mentioned, but however, they had opportunities to win games and close out games, and it just didn't do it. I feel their discipline was one factor. I thought they weren't very good also in the face-off circle, but it's something you can indeed build on, and you went to overtime in 3 games. You only won 1 game though, but that's not me discrediting them, so I just thought after the fact they could have done better. Finishing the 11th, it's going to be the Los Angeles Kings, and for me, it's going to be a D+ for me. The Kings beat a team that was completely sleeping in the first 2 games, but then Edmonton ended up getting a lifeline, and they almost slipped up both times, honestly. So the rest of the series, they were not the better team at all. And honestly, I just thought they would have had the best chance of eliminating the Oilers this year, even though I didn't think that would happen. But it ended up just being the complete opposite compared to what we've seen in these previous years. I just was not impressed with the Kings at all. Finishing 10th, we have the St. Louis Blues, and I'll be giving them a C+. And it can be argued that the St. Louis Blues were the better team overall in this series against the Winnipeg Jets. But their slip up in Game 7 is the honest difference maker in this report card, as they found different ways to lose against Winnipeg while they were also competitive in those road games. And then at home, they just completely knocked them out of the park every single time, and Winnipeg just appears ghost. St. Louis has a ton of potential going into next season, so this will be something to build on with their new head coach. Finishing in 9th, I have the Colorado Avalanche, and I'll be giving them a C+. The Colorado Avalanche, they had things going right for them, but then it felt like you just snapped your finger and it turned out the other team would win. And I felt Colorado was the better side in round one, but they gave Dallas, honestly, too much life at times, and it felt like they were just depending on their goaltending to save them, which was not a problem all series long. And it just, they get knocked out. And, Colorado had everything they needed to succeed, and it did not happen that way. So I'm interested how they'll finish coming up in the regular season coming up next year. Moving on, two teams have been knocked out in round two. With eighth, we have the Vegas Golden Knights. I'm going to be giving them a C-. And I was not impressed with how Vegas looked at all throughout these entire playoffs compared to my expectations, as they typically make deep playoff runs, right? And their goaltending was not there all the time. They had a lot of bad starts in their games as well. Injuries did not help their case, but then it felt like no one stepped up for Vegas at all. And, they end up getting knocked out, and they have to be better next time around if they want to make a long playoff run. Finishing seventh, I have the Washington Capitals. They'll be getting a B- from me. The Washington Capitals won round one, and I wouldn't say it was with ease, but their depth completely showed up in round one and was the difference maker. But then when it came to round two, that just completely changed, and their power play couldn't find a way to help them out, which they could have really used. Their depth didn't show up either. I thought they could have been better throughout the entire playoffs. And I feel next season this will be the same Washington team we'll see as we saw in the playoffs in the regular season coming up. Finishing sixth, I have the Winnipeg Jets, and they'll be getting a C for me. They won the President's Trophy, and then as soon as they get into the playoffs, it looks like they didn't win it at all. And you would have never thought that. They were almost eliminated in round one to a team that outplayed them throughout the series, in my opinion. And then they go against a more experienced team in round two, which is when they get knocked out. It seemed like being at home really seemed to be the only signs of life they really had for the most part. And Connor Hellebuyck played the worst hockey of his career, and some Winnipeg players did show out, but it wasn't enough. Finishing fifth, I have the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I'm giving them a B. And the Maple Leafs went as far as they did in my entire lifetime, yet people trashed them and complained like crazy still. They started off good against Ottawa, even though they could have been better in the second half of their games. And then in round two, they did battle with Florida, but then when they let off the gas, that was the difference maker for them in the playoffs in round two. The loss of stars seemed to bring the morale down, but they just should have done better, because Woll is also a good goalie in my opinion. And I thought they were quite good, so I don't understand all the bashing and everything. I mean, you got knocked out in Game 7 of round 2 to the eventual Stanley Cup champions, who just went back-to-back, who were also defending at the time, and they're the only team that had them on the brink of elimination throughout the whole postseason. But, once they lost Game 3 off a lucky bounce, it just seemed all the fans pretty much turned on them, which is pretty sad. Finishing in fourth, I have the Carolina Hurricanes, and I'm just giving them a B, honestly. The Carolinas, they ended up winning a game in the Eastern Conference Final, so good for them. But their performances in the first 3 games was truly unacceptable in my opinion. Their identity just completely disappeared as they were completely rolling through the first 2 series, and then once they went into round 3, they just pretty much disappeared. They were definitely good until whatever happened when they went up against the Florida Panthers, so hopefully they can build on winning a single game from the Eastern Conference Finals compared to all the other years where they've been swept. In third, I have the Dallas Stars, who will be getting a B from me. The Dallas Stars found ways to win in round 1, and it seemed like they just wouldn't win some games, and then they did very well in round 2, and then after Game 1 of the Western Conference Finals, they just honestly completely disappeared. They end up losing 4 games in a row, and their elimination game was an extremely poor start in my opinion. They don't have a head coach right now, so that should be a big statement in itself. So overall, a change of leadership is necessary, which it looks like they are looking to do that. And I know a lot of fans aren't very happy with Jamie Benn, who's the captain of the team. In second, I had the Edmonton Oilers, so be getting A-. The Edmonton Oilers started off slow, but I felt they got better throughout the playoffs. And, I felt they gave Florida fight and had solid starts, but Florida would just end up scoring that first goal, and that was the true difference maker. It sucks for them to get knocked out in back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals, but I felt they weren't as good as last year, and to end up in the same spot is honestly really good, and the injuries, especially Zach Hyman, didn't help them either, but their goaltending also had moments, which I felt was the difference maker, and the defense wasn't good from the very start to the very end. And with your Stanley Cup champions in first, the Florida Panthers, they're just going to get an A. They have a recipe to winning, and they pretty much replicated it from last year, but better. Their forechecking was great, and their physical play got cleaner and cleaner throughout the playoffs. That's me referencing the Tampa and Florida series, where I just felt they were targeting, which I understand Hagel started all of that, and I agree. But the injuries and all that really pissed me off and put my respect level to Florida quite down, but it's risen a little back up right now. Bobrovsky wasn't as good as last year, but as my friend says, that's very hard to replicate, which I can agree completely. And then, everyone just showed out, and, everyone fought. That gives you a Stanley Cup overall. And I couldn't tell you a weakness, honestly. But whatever their roster looks like next year, I expect a deep playoff run again, and I will not sleep on the Florida Panthers anymore. And, I feel they'll be able to keep those key players due to the salary cap rising. All right, that will be it for the 2025 Stanley Cup Playoff Series on the channel. It was amazing to upload all these videos for y'all. It was a really fun time for myself to share my hockey knowledge and thoughts while also interacting with y'all in the comments. Coming up at the end of the month, we got another GM type of video coming out, which will be after the NHL draft, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, I just want to say thanks for the support, and I hope to catch you soon. Take care.